So, Kallen, thank you for talking with me. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Washington, D.C., in 2004,
What month?
February.
Does that make you an Aquarian, a Pisces? The fish?
Aquarius.
Aquarian. So they tend to be visionary, innovative, future oriented. Do you identify with those traits at all?
I guess so, yeah.
What words would you use to describe yourself to someone who doesn't know you?
Um, I work really hard. So I suppose I'm motivated, very self-motivated. I'm very loyal, um, and generally just try to be compassionate and useful as much as I can be.
I know that you have a brother. Do you have other siblings, or that's it?
Just my brother.
And is he younger?
He's a year and a half younger, yeah.
And is he as interested in climate activism as you are?
Hmm. He's not as self-involved as I am, but the entire family is involved, so he's still pretty interested.
Right. Would you have been as involved if your parents weren't? In other words, how much of an influence have they been?
Um, well, that's hard to say because we did start kind of doing activism as a family, and it was my brother and I who originally said, let's go and join some of the protests. Um, but I was influenced a lot by my mother being a marine scientist working for the government for many years. So I was brought up with knowledge of the science and knowledge of climate change as a anthropogenic thing that was happening that we were causing. Um, so that certainly made it a lot easier to begin as an activist and to move forward into that realm. And we've always been involved in the Quaker community, going to our church here. Um, and my church and the community as a whole is fairly socially active. So I was kind of raised in that area. So it's kind of hard to tell since there were aspects of my upbringing that kind of led me this way. Um, but we did start as a family.
Nice. That makes it easier. It's interesting because the Quakers were really involved in abolition of slavery. I mean, they have a history since at least the 19th century of being socially aware and active.
They do, yes. And my church has always been, it's a fairly new Quaker church. I'm in the Annapolis area. And I grew up like in first day school, which is what we call Sunday school. We were taught about the civil rights movement and abolitionists and kind of social change throughout history, as well as things like international politics, and then Bible stories too, and that sort of thing. But there was a lot of different things that we were taught about, and a lot of social justice being talked about. And there's many people in my meeting that have issues that they're working on, whether that be social justice or homelessness or climate change. And a lot of it is interwoven and makes for a lot of crossover and just a lot of general education on the issues.
Traditionally, Quaker meetings didn't have a preacher. People spoke as the spirit moved. Is it still that way?
Yes, so we have two branches of Quakerism, and then also smaller little kind of branches on either side, but the main two are programmed and unprogrammed. The program meetings who have preachers and ministers tend to be slightly more conservative and more to the middle of the country, and then the programmed or the Hicksite dominates most of the eastern and western shores. And my meeting is unprogrammed.
And do young people speak up as much as older people?
Um, that's hard to say, since the population it leans older, um, and oftentimes what I've noticed, at least in the Quakers, is that the youth will go to church up until about high school, middle school, where they'll kind of back down a little bit, and then maybe they'll come back, because there's kind of that period of figuring yourself out and figuring, if you consider yourself a Quaker or if you don't consider yourself a Quaker. I've certainly seen kids speak in meeting, but it's a little harder to tell given that it's a lot when you're originally kind of following your parents' lead and then you're kind of trying to find out who you are.
Right. That's the nature of adolescence, right?
Yeah.
When I talked to you in 2018 at the San Francisco March, by the way, people can look at that video on my YouTube and your channel and see the parachutes as well as you. You were there showing the parachutes. So how did you get involved with that kind of movement? Where did the idea come from? It seemed it's pretty Kallen Benson.
Well, that started in 20. When was the People's Climate March?
2018 September.
Yes, but the second People's Climate March.
Oh, the big one in New York.
No, that the big one in New York was in 2014. Then there was another one in DC, and then we had one in San Francisco. So one of my first kind of big protests that I went to was the 2014 one in New York. And when they, again, with Quakers, we went down in a bus. My brother and I were really little. And when they announced that they were going to have one in DC, I wanted to do something a little bit more. And I really wanted to get more kids involved. I mean, my initial idea was kind of just get a big butterfly and as many kids as I could to hold it. And as we kind of sat around the kitchen table talking about that, and discussing what we wanted to do, we came up with the idea of the parachute. Originally just to kind of, just for the logistical reasons, but then we also really liked the imagery in that, the idea of a safe landing. So we ordered this big blank white 24-foot parachute, spread it out on in our front yard, and just marked out this big monarch butterfly in black Sharpie markers. It took us 2 weeks to color everything in. And then we took it around to schools and basically any place that had schools, churches, clubs. We spread it out on the National Mall a couple times, took it to the Science March, to gather signatures of young people in the DC metropolitan area. And within 6 weeks, we ended up getting around 1,600 signatures.
On the parachute itself?
Yes, on the parachute itself. And we took it to carry it in the march. And one of the kids, we had taken it to an old friend of mine's school, and she was helping us gather signatures and take it to the classes. And one of the kids was Ari Rubenstein. And a couple months later, his father, Barton, called us up and said, hey, we've got this organization called the Mother Earth Project, and we'd like to expand the parachute project. And from conversations with him and Ari, we started Parachutes for the Planet, trying to, with inspiration from the original parachute and the AIDS Quilt Project, trying to get these kind of parachutes from all over the world talking about climate change. And the idea is to use it as a communicator while making it, being able to foster discussions, and kind of explore some of the emotional aspects in whatever they're putting on, what they want to say from their community, and then use it as an educational tool and an advocacy tool further on. Fostering more discussions and conversations, taking it to marches. We've taken them lobbying in DC and in state legislators, as well as Canada's done some of that as well. And it's really exploded. I wasn't expecting it.
Right. So that it started in 2015 in preparation for the DC March.
Yeah, 2015, 2016 about. Yes.
2015.
Here, let me look it up.
And while you're looking, how many parachutes do you have from how many countries now?
We we started in 2017.
Okay.
No, 2016. 2016. Because we started the year before planning. We have every continent except Antarctica. And last time the count keeps changing on me, but it's several thousand now. I can pull up the exact right here. The website does that to me every time. We have 3,000-ish now. 3,300.
From how many countries?
I don't know that count. I'd have to ask Barton. But they're spread out a lot. And some of them, originally, we were gathering all the parachutes in one area. So people were shipping them to us, and now we have some of them. And some people are keeping theirs to use in their local community.
How much does one weigh roughly? I'm just trying, because we think of parachutes as being really expansive, but I'm curious how much it costs to ship it, or how heavy it is to carry a bunch of them.
It really depends. So first you have the size. It depends on the size and then what material it's made out of. So we do have these nylon ones that are, my big 24-foot one it's probably, I don't know, 5 pounds maybe. Somewhere around there. It's not too bad to carry. And once it's spread out, when you have different, you need a minimum of probably 3 people to carry it, and then just however many you can have. And then the 10 and 15 ones are pretty light. And then some of them are made on bed sheets, and those can be heavier. And then the more paint you put on it, the heavier it gets. So
I imagine circular tablecloths would work too.
Mm-hmm. Really any fabric.
Right.
We've also had people use actual canvas, and that can get really heavy once it's
painted on. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then where do you store the ones that are with you?
So Barton has an artist studio in his backyard because he's a sculptor. So he has them in there. And then I have a couple of the parachutes at my house.
And who is Barton?
Barton is one of the co-founders of the Mother Earth Project
What other, I know you work with Fridays for Future. How did that get involved? How did you get involved with that, and what's been your role?
Well, I've been involved for a while. I got involved in 2018, in late 2018. It was just Greta started striking in August, and I was looking for other youth doing things, and we were looking at the map on the website and noticing that there were no strikes in the United States. So I started striking in December on December 7th of 2018, and another kid called Zane, who's up in New York, her family and my family both started striking on the same day, and those were the first two strikes in the United States. And then as it started to get more people, and March 15th came around, and we were just trying to sort of organize the youth in the United States. So I was working on the national group of Fridays for Future in the U.S., as well as on the international level with kids in kids all over the world, just working to organize and get ready for our strikes.
Did you and Zane coordinate, or were you doing this independently, striking?
No, it was actually completely accidental.
Oh,
So we didn't know the other was striking. Actually, our second day of striking, we were striking at AGU, the American Geophysical Union, a sort of gratitude strike. They were having their fall conference in DC, and Zane's mother, my mom being a government scientist, had friends there. And Zane's mother, Eve, just ran into us outside because she was there with and said, "Hey, I have to go back tomorrow because I've gotta go strike with Zane." So that's how we met. Just the second weekend began coordinating and trying to figure out who else was striking.
and were you both using the Fridays for Future label at that point?
Yes.
And then you found out about it on social media like Instagram?
Um, It just came through the channels. I wasn't really looking. I've never been super involved in social media, but being involved in climate activism, I get it on my news feed. I get it from other climate activists. So I don't really remember where exactly I saw what was happening. And I suspect it came from different sources. But Greta was certainly starting to get more acknowledgement in the US come the fall. And that's kind of when I started hearing about it.
Got it. So at this point, it's fair to say you and Zane started the first Fridays for Future strikes in the U.S.?
Yeah, we started striking. Our strikes were the first in the US, and another friend, Sophia Mathur, was the first in North America.
And then you just kind of bumped into her online, Sophia.
Sophia and her mother, Kathy, I already knew. Because I met Kathy while organizing Parachutes for the Planet. So Kathy works for Citizens Climate Lobby. And when we were just starting to promote Parachutes for the Planet and trying to get people to make parachutes, we went on to the Citizens Climate website. And all of their local chapters, the email addresses are posted on their website. So my mom and my dad and I were just camped out in our house for like a day, sending an email to every single one of those addresses. And a couple months went by, and Kathy responded as the international coordinator, had just missed the email and found it in her inbox. And we started talking with her, and she helped me connect with some of the African Citizens Climate Lobby chapters. And then we met her in DC for the Citizens Climate Lobby conference. And then we've been bumping into Kathy and spending time with her and her daughter off and on ever since.
That's a great story. So at this point, when you say strike, do you mean leave school on Friday with posters, placards, or what form has striking taken for you?
For me, I mean, it's a little different because I'm homeschooled. Um, so I don't do schoolwork on Fridays, and I will go out with signs. And I also have friends who go to school, but they come after school. So it's slightly different. There are, and it's also given the United States, it depends how the school district is going to react based on where they are. Um, and it also depends on even just the teacher that they have. So it can vary a lot. So that's what striking looks like for me. And right now, obviously, we're not doing physical strikes nationally or internationally because of the coronavirus. Though there are some people in Europe who are just starting to strike again, which is pretty exciting. Hopefully, we'll get there soon.
Right. I don't. Doesn't look very promising right now. Have you
No,
always been homeschooled for all
I've
your?
always been homeschooled.
And then how do you get like a foreign language and a biology lab and chemistry lab and those kind of things that most homes don't really have?
Well, my mom was trained as a marine scientist and worked for the Office of Education for NOAA. So I kind of had a very good teacher when it came to science, and we did a lot of experiential learning. When I was younger, we used to do homeschool classes at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center here in Edgewater. And I've been volunteering, my brother and I have been volunteering there for years, working on both the fish tanks at their education center, but then also a couple of their research projects, um, which that's part of our science. And then we also do mathematics online um, using Khan Academy. Um, and then language, my brother is dyslexic, so that is taken kind of at his own pace, however he can. I've done a little bit of Spanish, and then I do some of that online, and then also having a lot of friends around the world, I kind of dabble in a little bit here and there.
Where are you thinking of for university? You have 2 more years of high school?
About, yeah. I don't really know yet. It'll have to depend. We'll see where we are in 2 more years and where my work is as well. Um, a lot of homeschoolers here in my area who stay homeschooled throughout high school because most homeschoolers stop at around middle school. But those who don't tend to take some community college classes. So I might do some of that and then just transfer into university, but we'll see what happens.
And then what would you major in at this point? It could certainly change.
Um, at this point, I mean, probably some type of science,
Right.
most likely some type of life science.
Mm-hmm. Um, what as in terms of Fridays for Future, how many chapters in the U.S.? I don't know if you know how many chapters globally. How big is it now?
It's pretty big, pretty mind-blowingly big, and it's been amazing to watch it grow. It's been quite an exciting several years. Um, in the US, we had between 300 to 500 locations. Now, chapters, it's kind of hard to tell because we are an organic movement. So that's just going on strike registration numbers. And there is a slight difference between weekly strikers and the big strikes that we have kind of every quarter-ish. Um,
And then, do you have any idea how many chapters or locations globally?
No, there's a lot. And it does vary a little bit. Our last big strikes, which were last September, had how many was it? 3.7 million,
Million.
somewhere around there. Um, or was it, Mom? How many people did the September deep strikes have? Nearly 3 million. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Mom.
Yes. I always end up forgetting the statistics eventually. um, and that was for a deep strike, which is when we kind of centralized a lot of our energy on one day. Um, but I don't know the global numbers.
What are
And
you doing in terms of the September 25th, 2020 strike that's planned? How are you organizing for that?
well, I mean that came out of the polling working group, but only a couple days ago. Um, it's been interesting to hear the different responses. So far, it looks like a lot of countries are going to be doing some sort of digital action. The US doesn't really know what they're going to do yet. We will figure it out eventually. Um, it will probably do a digital action of some sort, considering the trajectory it looks like we're on right now. I don't think there's going to be many people doing actual physical strikes at the moment, especially not the ones that we typically do on a big strike date, which has a lot of people in one area. Um, but we've only gotten that information very recently, so it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. And so much of it happens so quickly.
What mechanism do you use to stay coordinated in the US and globally? Slack, Zoom, how often, who calls the, the, the conferences?
It's all over the place. So it really kind of depends. Internationally, we use a ton of platforms. For the conference calling, it's usually Zoom. Occasionally, we use Jitsi. Um, then for communication, we use Discord, Slack, WhatsApp, a lot on Telegram. I mostly communicate with Telegram internationally. And then there is some coordination over social media with Twitter, group chats, and a little bit on Instagram. Um, Nationally, we've mostly used Slack. Um, Mostly Slack, again, some use of WhatsApp. Um, Internationally, there's also some use of Signal. Forgot that one. Um, and then we typically use Zoom or Jitsi. We have used Jitsi before.
So when you're on an international call, is it organized by task group, like the this reach out to media task group? They talk internationally, or does everybody who wants to, who's involved with Fridays for Future, jump in?
It depends. So we have different groups. There are some working groups that are working on specific areas. So there's the webinar working group and the planning and polling working group. We've also had structuring working groups and media working groups. So those happen. There are calls specific for that. And then there are also calls that are kind of open to everybody. So we used to have a weekly call just to kind of update everybody and update on everyone's country. That hasn't been happening as much recently, just because people have been kind of taking a breath. But so it's kind of separated. We have some big ones and then these ones that are more specific.
And then who facilitates the big ones? I mean, how, because it can be chaotic. You know, I want to say something, you want to say something, blah, 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 blah. How is it organized in a way where it's coherent?
We pick a moderator. And then it depends on who it depends on who is moderating and how many people are on the call. So if there's a ton of people, we'll use a stack process where either people raise their hand or just put a star in the chat. Or if it's a small call, it'll be less formal, and we'll just have a moderator that kind of keeps people on time and make sure we're not going off subject.
What about people who don't speak English? I'm thinking of South Americans that I've talked to said it's a problem because they don't speak English.
It can be a problem. We are having we are switching to having more Spanish provided. The German chats the Germans can go for a while. The Germans put a lot of resources into having like German stuff available, and then we are working on getting more Spanish available. For our 24-hour Earth Day webinar, what we did is we had each country take an hour, and we had some of the countries doing it in English and some of the countries doing it in Spanish. And then we also had Portuguese, and some did it half and half.
So is there a way during, let's say, a Zoom call that Spanish could run in words rather than having to wait to translate back and forth?
There is. I don't understand the technology quite yet, and you do need, I think you need another level of, Zoom has like these different paid levels that you can get. And since we are a movement, not an organization, we don't have money. So the Zoom accounts that we're typically on are free accounts. Though a couple of us, I have the joy of having the first level of a paid account. It makes you really popular if you have a paid account. But we have a couple of people kind of scattered around the world that have paid accounts and are called on to use them for webinars and some of the working group meetings and that sort of thing. But there is a function where you can have live interpretation going. It's not words so much as it is you have an interpreter speaking in that language at that time, and you just kind of switch the audio input. I've seen it done. I don't know how to do it. And I'm not sure what level. That's kind of the matter of having the resources to do it, and being teenagers and not having a lot of money and being a little disorganized. It can be difficult to get all of that together, for one thing.
It's kind of like how the UN does it. You just listen with your headphones to the language that you want.
Yeah, precisely. And there was at one point that we were thinking of reaching out to one of their interpretation services for one of the webinars.
Roughly how many people are in on a call, like a general call, a global one?
Oh, that fluctuates so much. It can range from, and it also depends. We have different chats. So we have 3 just kind of open international chats. And there is one that's actually pretty much completely on Spanish in WhatsApp. So I've been on calls where it's been under 10 people, and then I've been on ones where it's 100 and hundreds of people. So there's a lot of variety. It really depends, and you can't really predict it, which is the difficult part.
How much of a role does Greta play in coordinating or initiating, organizing all this?
Well, Greta's much more, Greta doesn't do a lot of internal organizing. She tries to be around and involved. I I think because she has so much of a media platform right now, she doesn't really want to push the movement to basically follow her. I think she's got so much of this kind of pressure and I'm not sure.
Attention.
Yeah, lots of attention and lots of just being focused on. And I don't think she really wants to influence the movement too much, being in that kind of celebrity focus area. But she does come around, and she's involved as she can.
When you've met her, how did it seem like she was coping with all the criticism and the cynicism and the attacks, especially with her history of autism spectrum previously? I guess it sounded like anorexic according to her mother's book, mute. I mean, so she had fairly fragile growing up. How was she coping with all this huge media focus?
I mean, the way that I've seen Greta is she's coping with it by by I mean, she found her passion and what she wants to do with the world, and that's what she's focusing on. And I don't think she's paying too much attention to the kind of cloud around her. I mean, when I've met her, it's been in the middle of incredibly hectic times in strikes, where I'm overwhelmed, she's overwhelmed, and we're just trying to get through the day. Um, so it's about focusing on the issue and not getting too caught up. Um,
But when you think about it, I mean, it's amazing to go from being mute and not being able to attend school to being a globally known name. I mean, that's got to have some kind of huge effect on how you deal with life. I can't imagine it.
oh, certainly, and I don't think she would have chosen it. Um, and certainly, it's interesting. You can tell like when she was in the US, just every moment there were cameras on her and people around her. And I think she was pretty happy to get out of here, honestly. Um, but and I know talking to my friends in Sweden, there's not as much attention placed on her at home. So that's good.
Do you get any of that kind of troll attack on social media, or you're just a pawn of your manipulative liberal parents, or do you get any of that kind of backlash or not?
I do get some. I always love the ones where it's like the parents are controlling the kids, because you get that. What I find is that being an activist that has an activist family, whenever someone disagrees with a decision that you're making or with an opinion that I have, their immediate reaction is, oh, it must be the parents. I'm like, no, I just disagree with you on this one. And that can happen inside the activism realm and outside of the activism realm. So that can be an activist telling you or an online troll. So you actually find that a lot being from an activist family. Um, but I mean, the thing is, the deniers I don't really pay much attention to because I mean, I kind of feel like that. They're loud and they're annoying, but they're kind of a little fly. The majority of people do believe in human climate change and do know it's real. What I'm more worried about is activating all of those people that know that climate change exists, but just have kind of compartmentalized it into something that they don't really have to worry about. The deniers are just gonna have to die out eventually.
I just read an article that government officials are pressured not to use the word climate change or climate crisis, and they really feel they have to censor their reports so they don't mention those words to
Oh,
make
yeah,
just
definitely.
just we any possible prayers go Trump do not get reelected.
Yes, no, I've certainly seen that in even some of the local Maryland politics. People put so much weight and attention into that word, um, into that name. And it just, there are times when I just find myself saying, but no, you just can't argue with this. You don't argue about it. It's facts. You say it's facts. You acknowledge it's facts. That's just where we are. Um, but unfortunately, people have politicized it. And my answer to that is just don't let them politicize it. You don't, it's not a political issue. It's facts.
Right, that's the whole Fridays for Future message. Listen to the scientists.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
In terms of that Fridays for Future and the parachutes activists that you've met or know of, roughly what percent are young women?
That's very interesting. I don't, the majority of the young climate activists that I've met in the US are female, um, which I've always found rather interesting. It's like it's always, you walk into a room with when it comes to young activists, and it's typically like almost, I'd say 10 to 1 maybe,
Wow.
because it's very dominated by females. Um, I've internationally, it's interesting because I see slightly more male, but it's still female dominated. Um, I think that might be because of how much we in the US have made caring a female trait, and possibly some of the toxic masculinity issues that we have, which certainly are not isolated to the US, but we put so much emphasis on it sometimes. Um, but it's definitely, especially here, it's really female. Um, and it's always been interesting to watch that, especially growing up and starting early as an activist and watching as more, the earlier you start, kind of the less peers there are. And as you get older, you kind of watch as people join.
Someone I interviewed in Georgia said that for adolescents, for boys, it's not cool to be an activist. I guess if you're cool, you're an athlete or a band member or something. So I wonder if you see that as a coolness influence that keeps boys away.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Like that idea that the idea of caring about something or someone or anything, and like almost just putting effort in.
But they can care about their football team or their soccer team or something, right? Or is that
right,
really different?
but they can, but it's considered more of a traditional masculine interest. That's more acceptable, and going and saying, "Hey, I want to switch the cafeteria trays to reusable," is going to be something that I think is considered more feminine. And yeah, it's something that would be more acceptable for a girl in middle school than it would be for a boy in middle school. So I guess you could call that coolness.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me because you'd think after decades of the women's movement that would have changed.
Yeah, but even, I mean, it's so we've changed so much, but there's still so much that has to be changed, and has to be moved. I mean, there's still a lot that we've internalized. And even in the climate movement and environmental movements, you see that because there are less boys, when a boy does join, they are kind of going to be sought out, to kind of make it a broader spectrum. Um,
Interesting. Um, the one of the issues that I'm hearing about adolescence is that there is an increasing rate of anxiety and depression, especially for teen girls. And I wondered if you see that in your peer group. And it's not just climate anxiety, it's like body image because of social media induced anxiety. Do you see that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, in climate activism spaces, there is a ton of mental health issues that I've seen in adolescent climate activism spaces, and unfortunately, that can lead to a lot of problems because we don't have the support to give them. I mean, another teenage girl can only give that teenage girl so much, while also dealing with her own issues and her own mental health, and trying to support another person through that can be exhausting. Um, but there's definitely a lot of it. I've seen a lot of it, and I know a lot of different girls and even some guys who have it.
Who are anxious and depressed?
Anxiety, there's a lot of anxiety. I've seen some depression, not as much, and then eating disorders.
And is that in the climate activist milieu? Is that climate anxiety, or is it a more generalized anxiety, including body image and, as you say, eating disorders?
Um, most of the diagnosed anxiety is general anxiety, and there is a lot of that. But then there's also a lot of climate anxiety. It just tends to be more of a spectrum from kind of manageable to unmanageable. And I have seen youth that have just really lots of climate anxiety, and just don't know how to really deal with it. And because it's so negative, it can negatively affect the spaces
I
that they are
just
in.
did a new book called Calm: How to Thrive in Challenging Times, which I'll send to you because it could be of use. It's about how to stay centered and grounded.
Hmm.
What I've heard from people around the world is that the people who are in the forefront tend to think of themselves as not mainstream. They're on the autism spectrum, they're LGBTQI, they're artists, they're theater people, they're homeschooled or whatever, but they identify as not being a normal quote unquote teen. Do you hear that kind of discussion?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that's partially because climate activism is kind of self-selecting. I mean, you're getting the minority of youth, so you're not going to be getting the majority or average kid. You're going to be getting the different ones. So, um,
But why?
yeah.
Because the issues is the same. Everyone is going to be facing the same future. So why don't the majority ones think, "Oh, I'm tired of floods and hurricanes and you know
Um,
warming"?
well, partially it's a bit of a maturity issue. It's also it's also their families. Sometimes I do know some kids who have conservative families, but came to be more liberal as they got older. But where I've seen that is when they have gone to more liberal leaning schools and been involved with and been friends with more liberal leaning people. So you're not going to be getting the person who comes from conservative families in a conservative area, but also it's kind of, you have to step out and do it yourself, right? If no one else in your school is doing climate activism, you have to start. And that takes a level of confidence, a level of support from people around you, a level of knowledge that you might not have, especially if you have grown up in the public school system, which has very hit or miss climate education. And kind of a almost a guide to knowing how to do it, whether you've seen Greta and can start striking, or you've grown up a Quaker and been taught about protests your entire elementary school life. You have to kind of know how to step out there and do it.
What about the body image stuff? Do you feel impacted by that at all, by social media, or doesn't it influence you to think I'm too this or not enough that?
When I find that I'm worried about my body, it's typically I'm typically upset about something else. Like it's something I actually look and find that, oh well, this is upset. I'm not happy because it's one of these days, or I'm really because um, I have always been fairly confident. I think that comes from a couple of things. Being brought up homeschooled and really not exposed to a whole lot of peer pressure. But also just being kind of told that I can be who I want to be and do whatever I want to do as long as I can figure out how to do it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's another point. I think that parenting has changed. That parents do give that message to their kids, whereas before, the earlier generations would say kids should be seen and not heard, and you should respect your elders or spare the rod and spoil the child. So over the decades, it seems like parenting has evolved to that more egalitarian connection with kids.
Right. And that's a lot of how my mom was growing up as well. And I grew up with both my parents here, but also my grandparents right across the street. And I think part of how my mom was raised had partly to do with the fact that they had three children who were all girls. Um, so I don't know, it's interesting. And obviously my parents have changed a little bit too when I was born, they were both commuting into DC and both had office jobs in the DC area. My dad was a lawyer, mom worked for the government, and now they're both at home spending 24/7 with my brother, and I am doing activism most of the time. So there has been a change throughout there.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of a different question. For earlier social movements, books were really important, like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, or Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex for the women's movement, or Rachel Carson's Silent Spring for climate activism. I wonder if there are books like that that have influenced your thinking, or it's mostly social media today.
Um, for me, I don't think it's social media or literature, though for me, the news is very important. I've been reading the Washington Post since who knows how long. But the kind of mentors that I've been grown up with, my parents being there and teaching me the science, but then also growing up with Quakers who were teaching me, and then also other adults who are in the climate movement who have kind of, as of now, basically watched me grown up, and helped me to become who I am today.
What groups besides Fridays for Future that are youth-led, and what other groups, like 350.org, that are started by adults, do you look to for, oh, I want cutting-edge information, I want to be inspired, or whatever? Who do you follow?
Well, for information about climate change, I'm typically looking at more of scientific sources, so what's happening, and my dad's looking for that a lot, and when for a portion of my life in kind of middle school and early high school, we were doing work on climate stewards of Greater Annapolis who were having speaker series, so we would go to a lot of those. For youth-led movements, I mean, it depends on what you mean by movement. I have kind of learned that there is a big difference between movement and organization, because a movement is organic energy from people that throws people together by them joining. And the climate movement as a whole is that. Fridays for Future is a movement, and an organization is slightly different. Part of that has a lot to do with the fact that money is involved in one and one isn't. I have been involved with 350.org because I have people who used to work on Maryland politics who have switched into 350. So I've been more involved with them recently. Greenpeace has helped us out a little bit. Here in the U.S., the youth organizations that are around the local Sunrise chapter, ACE was always helpful.
I don't know ACE.
The Alliance for Climate Education, which is not youth-led, but focuses on youth.
What about 0 Hour?
I used to be a part of 0 Hour, so they're a great group of kids. I don't think I can give a objective.
Do you want to explain that?
They're a wonderful group of kids and are very passionate about the issue.
I hear a little but.
Well, I mean, I used to be a part of them. The thing about youth is that a lot of the youth climate movement are teenagers, and that is the period where people are figuring themselves out and finding out who they are. And there's a lot of also figuring out what climate activism is and where it should be going and where that should be, and gaining experience and learning. And you're going to have, that's going to come with a certain amount of kind of growing pains and adjustments.
So what would be differences in strategies or tactics between 0 Hour and FFF?
Well, I honestly don't really know what they're doing right now, but 0 Hour is a more organized top-down organization that has a slightly more structured approach to it, and kind of titles within it. FFF is a loose organic movement that's international, so it's hard to compare the two.
So when you're lobbying politicians in Maryland or DC, what do you find works? What makes them listen and pay attention and not just go, oh, blah, 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 blah?
Well, I find there's two things. First, it's getting a personal connection. I mean, whether that's the person who's representing your district, or whether that's just, oh, we have friends here, or just like talking. You go in and having a conversation that's not just about what you're there for. And then I mean, there's a reason you have paid lobbyists. Being there more than once and kind of fostering that relationship with the office, and not just the elected official, but also their staff members. So I think that you're going to have more impact if you do have that kind of relationship and connection with the office, and they've grown to kind of trust you. Apart from that, I mean, when you're having a lobby day with a lot of people coming in, it's basically showing the numbers that are supporting this. And it's here we have X amount of people from your district, and there's a lot of support for this, and they're actually willing to come here and ask for this from you. And again, just making it be a pleasant conversation. I mean, you've got to remember that they're people too, and if you're coming in there with kind of a script, it's going to be less effective than if you come in there and have a conversation with them and sometimes even talk about climate change. I mean, you'd be amazed at sometimes you really have to go back to the basics and talk through that, and then talk through why this is important. And obviously having that takes a certain amount of knowledge to be able to do that, and to be able to have the confidence to do that. And it's going to be different whether you're on the federal level or the state level or the county level, what type of relationship and what type of kind of conversation you can have, and whether you're going to actually see the elected official or a staff member.
I know that Sunrise's main thrust is the Green New Deal, and they have big groups of people who go to the congressional offices and bring in AOC and that kind of thing. Do you agree with that strategy, that the Green New Deal is the main program to push in the U.S. and globally, actually?
Well, I guess I mean, I would love to see the Green New Deal get passed. I'm kind of at the point right now where if anything gets passed, I would be pretty happy. And we're going to have to continue pushing to get actual climate legislation nationally and state level. When people say they're advocating for the Green New Deal, I always kind of wonder what that means. Because there is a difference between the kind of idea of the Green New Deal and the ideal that Sunrise wants to see and that they've been pushing for, which I think is wonderful, and then the Green New Deal resolution that is in Congress right now, because that resolution is a non-binding resolution, which means it doesn't do anything. But basically, the thing that it does is say that Congress kind of endorses this and says it's an okay thing, and that we're willing to say that. But it doesn't actually make any changes. So I would love to see the Green New Deal. Right now, it's kind of, I want to see something passed that does something. So if we get the resolution passed, if we get an actual Green New Deal passed, I'll be happy. It's just a matter of getting there.
Right, and that depends if Biden or Trump is president next year.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see, just because I don't know how the election's going to go. Not to mention, even if Biden wins, how Trump is going to react to that. And then I don't think Biden is also, we're going to have to put effort in and push him a lot, since he's certainly a more middle of the ground Democrat. So we're going to have to put a lot of work in to push him to take. So we're not going to be able to rest. But I certainly hope that he wins and not Trump.
In social movements recently, the last decades, there's been a lot of emphasis on the way you reach people is tell stories. My house was flooded. You know, I was in Sandy Hook and this happened or that. I mean, Hurricane Sandy, not Sandy Hook. So, do you agree with that? Is that the most effective strategy, or what tack do you take if you are trying to reach your peers?
So I find the way to reach high schoolers and kind of youth, the easiest way to get them involved is through their friends. And that's a matter of building that connection with the person. So I do agree that storytelling is a really incredible tactic to be able to use. But I think when you're actually getting people involved, it's a matter of making a connection with them and them bringing that back to their community and bringing more people in. And it's a slow process, and that's going to take time. And that's storytelling and talking about our experiences is part of that.
I think the story that you told when we had our brief interview in 2018 was when you were 9, there was a huge flood in the river near you. Does that ring a bell?
I don't think so. We did. Uh, Hurricane Isabel went through, not when I was 9, in the Annapolis area and flooded a lot of downtown and a lot of where we are. And we've seen increasingly more and more storm surges in the river, as well as just higher tides. And we have, I mean, if you look at downtown Annapolis, there's a ton of sunny day flooding, which it's amazing when you talk to your neighbors and even people in the area, how many people don't notice it.
So sunny day, you mean the tides come into the city?
Yeah, so we get these abnormally high tides, which come up the storm drains and flood the
Oh,
streets.
oh, oh, and that's increasing more.
Yeah, it's been getting worse and worse. Um,
Huh.
as time goes on. And it's been interesting to see how the city wants to cope with it. I mean, there has been some talk of mechanisms to deal with it. And I mean, people have talked about building a storm wall around the entirety of downtown Annapolis. And as my brother noted, okay, you build a storm wall, but the water still has to go somewhere. And then there has been talk about putting big pumps in as well. So it's all about moving and shifting the water, but not really about actually dealing with it.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking of the Dutch with their dikes and pumping water out. So when you think about the fact that we have maybe 10 years to stop global warming, that would be irrevocable tipping points beyond there's no return, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Um, I suppose I'm neither. My kind of thinking when it comes to action on climate change is at some point it's going to get so bad that people are forced to change.
Uh,
Um, and that'll come at different times for different people based on where they are. And we're just the sooner we can, the more action we can get before we actually hit that point, the better. And if we can prevent hitting that point at all, great. So I guess I'm pessimistically optimistic.
so you kind of implied that when you talk to politicians, some of them are kind of ignorant. So they have to be educated that the problem even exists.
Well, most of them know it exists. If they don't know exists, then they're almost always a denier. I've never found anyone who doesn't know that climate change exists. But I mean, we talk about sunny day flooding in Annapolis. I mean, you can have legislators that have offices a couple blocks away that haven't noticed it. So they know it exists. They've heard about the stories from around the world, but sharing your experiences and bringing it home. And also, I mean, I'm always amazed. There was one time I was up in New York at a youth climate summit, and we were in this workshop, and we were asked to break into groups and talk about how climate change has affected our areas. And I sat down with a couple of other kids, and I asked them how they had been affected, and both of them said, well, we haven't really seen any effects. And what I find there is that it's really, we haven't seen any effects because every area is being impacted in some way. And kind of, I find it's really useful to try and almost teach people what's happening where they are. And it can be really useful if there's someone from their area that's willing to kind of share stories and exchange experiences with them. Because I see a lot of that, feeling like climate change is far off, and it's somewhere else, and not realizing that it's here. And then just kind of showing people the effects that's right in front of them. Actually, what has been really interesting here in my area has been having the younger generations and the older generations talk. Because then neither of them will really see. But if you are having the older generations like telling stories about when the river would freeze over hard enough that you could ice skate on it. And then talking to the younger generations and kind of having that light bulb go off of, oh, that hasn't happened for 20 plus years, can be a pretty incredible experience.
Visual images can be really powerful. I think of like the polar bear on the ice floe. That really gets a lot of people, or the Australian little koala bears with burnt paws from the bushfires. So I'm thinking that that's one of the appeals of your parachutes, is you can get pictures of them spread widely. People don't have to see the actual parachute. So I'm wondering what kind of avenues you found to get the images of the parachutes out and about.
Well, I certainly take them to people and show them to people all the time. We do have the database on the website. So at this point, we've got pictures of most of the parachutes up there with some information about where they came from and their size and that sort of thing. And then social media, of course.
What's the link to your website so people can go to it?
So the database is on the Mother Earth Project website, which is motherearthproject.org. And then if you go to parachutes, you have information about the project as well as the database and the number count.
Do you have a goal, like I'd like to get 5,000, or is it just kind of a organic process? However it evolves, it evolves.
For me, it's a much more organic process, and watching as it kind of fluctuates and people pick it up. Barton updates the goal every time. So originally it was like 500, and then we hit that, so he bumped it up to 1,000, and then we hit that, and he just keeps bumping it up every time we hit them. But for me, it's much more organic.
Have you been able to travel out of the country at all and see meet some of the people who are doing the parachutes like you?
Not out of the country. I did go up to Canada, and saw a little bit up there, and we have gone around the country a little bit, going to New York and the Wild Center, and seeing some people around the country. But I don't go outside of the U.S. much.
Because you have to
Hopefully,
fly.
yes.
Or you can get a boat like Greta did.
Someday I hope to. I have a lot of people I'd like to see around the world.
Right. Is there anything that you'd like to add about climate change, being an effective organizer, Gen Z, young women activists that we haven't talked about?
I guess, I guess with youth activists, the one thing I'd add is just kind of trying to find what's already happening. Because I do find that when a lot of youth activists come in, there's the immediate idea of having to sort of build something for your own, which I understand because it can be hard to find what's going on. But I find it's so much more useful to be connected and to learn what's going on and to see the different processes because everyone, I mean, there's a reason why we have so many different organizations because different people are going to have different approaches to climate activism and to pushing for the change that we need in the world. And you're not going to fit in every one. I mean, you're going to try one and that's not going to work for you, so you move on and find somewhere else. But going through that process can be very helpful and will educate your work for years.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think Gen Z seems uniquely confident in speaking out at a really young age? It seems unique.
I guess we have the platform and tools. I mean, we're at an age where we're able to have conference calls with kids around the world and to organize nationally, which wasn't something that we were able to do. And we're also able to get information from other sources. I mean, we're not relying on our parents and our communities as much, though they are incredibly important. We can still get information from different sources and from other areas.
Yeah. Thank you. That was great.